I'll often refer to it when I talk to families or talk to individuals and talk to youth is this is your story. This is your story. And so we want to tell you the story in a way that's well-rounded and that identifies, some nice clear spaces that help you move forward. But it's got to still feel like your story. And that I think is empowering, and I think it's more mobilizing than come in, I'm going to ask a bunch of very structured questions and then I'm going to, do things in a very fixed way.
Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're tuning into the Taking Good Care show. I'm Dr. Andrew Wong, based in Toronto, Canada.
And I'm Dr. David St. Arno, based in Edmonton, Canada. We're two practicing psychologists with over a decade of experience each, working in a variety of settings and supporting diverse populations.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. While we're both practicing psychologists, our podcast is intended purely for educational and entertainment purposes. It's not a substitute for professional mental health care or treatment. If you're in need of support, we strongly encourage you to reach out to a licensed mental health professional in your area. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I just want to start off by saying that I'm really excited for today's guest. It's Dr. Jacqueline Pei, but we all know her as Jackie. And we've known Jackie for a really long time because Jackie taught us.
Oh no.
So we're going back. I won't say how many years, but this is so fun. I think for me, Jackie, you've always helped me out whenever I've needed it, whether it's supervising assessments in the past, whether it's being a staff supervisor for a program that I wanted to launch. You've always said yes. And, your assessment reports, whatever I was able to get out of it has always been, how to make it accessible to people. And I think it's going to go towards that conversation today. So I'm just really excited because I haven't spoken with you in years since I left Edmonton. We might have connected once when I was in my internship, but that was about it. And here we are again. So the relationships is what I always value. So this is a lot of fun. So I'll do an intro and then we'll get into it. So Dr. Jackie Pei is a professor in the School and Clinical Child Psychology program and assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. Dr. Pei began her career as a criminologist and forensic counselor working with incarcerated youth. Motivated by this early work, she returned to academia to study youth at risk, child development, and neuropsychology. Now, as a researcher and a practicing registered psychologist for over 20 years, her research focus includes identification and evaluation of interventions to support healthy outcomes for structurally marginalized populations. Dr. Pei has over 150 peer-reviewed publications and reports, and has also recently released a book, Aim High, Growing the Motivational Potential of Youth Psychological Assessment. Above all, she values her collaborations with communities and government agencies and the meaningful relationships she builds with the families and youth she is privileged to work with. And I'm going to put Dr. Pei's website, her research team's website, on our description. So if you're interested in the research that she does, you want to check it out, please take a look at the description. And to learn more about her clinical practice, visit her clinic's website at www.empowergrowth.ca, and it's based out of Edmonton, Alberta. So welcome, Jackie. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I was pretty excited. You guys sent me an email and I thought, oh, what a great conversation this will be. Although I'm still grappling with you continuing to refer to how long I've known you. I have issues. I don't know if is somebody a good counselor, maybe somebody I could talk to about that.
Oh, geez. This is shining through already. So I don't even know if I need to mention it, but all of my experience with Jackie has been like, she's super down to earth, easy to talk to, no matter what. Like, we would be in these like meetings with high level conversations, and Jackie had a way of just making people feel comfortable around her. And one of the reasons why we wanted to bring her on, and one of the reasons why we thought she might say no, because she doesn't like the spotlight. At least this is my perspective, is, the spotlight is not always comfortable for her, but really where she shines is like bringing out the best in the people around her. So I am really excited to hang out and talk about assessment. We have not covered assessment on this podcast yet. So welcome, Jackie. I want to hear a little bit about your experience with assessment, and then we'll just kind of go from there.
I'm kind of blushing right now, so I'm a little flustered because you guys are saying such kind things and I don't know where to start. But I'm, as you know, really happy to have a conversation. And assessment is near and dear to my heart, and also something that sometimes I really loathe. So maybe that means I have a complex relationship with assessment. True story. So where do I start? I mean, I've been doing, assessment, psychological assessment through most of my career, and I think it's even woven into a lot of research I do, where we're really thinking about how informed understandings shape how we best respond and support and create opportunity for kids, teens, youth, young adults, all the way through. And I think that's sort of a passion of mine is saying, how do we use the things that we learn and we understand to inform the way folks develop. And I don't know. I don't think we're all that good at it all the time. And so that's maybe where the conflict and the tension comes from.
I think you're right, though. I think there is conflict and tension. I mean, I've done a bunch of assessments now, throughout the years, and even at my clinic, we do a ton of assessments in a year. And I'm very mindful of making sure that we're not an assessment mill, that we're being cognizant and mindful of how we complete assessments and how we deliver the information to our audience, whether that is teachers or caregivers or students themselves. But I think that's why assessments are interesting. They take a long time, right? The writing part of it can be grueling. And at the same time, it's like in and amongst some of those things that don't sound so glamorous, there's the investigation of it, which is very interesting. That piques I think, our intellectual property in terms of, oh, what's going on here? What's happening in this other person's beautiful brain?
Mhm.
As I heard that description from actually one of my clinicians who I've known since my days at the school board, she talks to kids like, let's see what's happening in your beautiful brain, right? Let's see what you're really good at and what might need some help to get it really start to go and really flourish from there. And so keeping it just very positive with the children, with the teenagers. And for those who don't know what an assessment is, for me anyway, and Jackie, Dave, you can both piggyback on this. It is trying to see what one's strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to learning and development. So if this is a psychoeducational assessment, it's primarily perhaps for learning, academics, school. So let's see what that student is really good at in terms of their problem-solving skills and their reasoning skills, and what are they relatively weaker at? And then how do we make sense of it so that this assessment can be useful? So how can those outcomes inform how teachers can teach, how principals may need to talk to the student, and strategies for home so that we can continue supporting the student in different environments? That's in a nutshell for me. I don't know if each of you want to add something onto that.
I think it's interesting. I always struggle with how to define assessment, and I work a lot with youth and love to work with youth and teens, and they'll come in and they'll be like, "What the heck is this assessment thing anyway?" And it's been really interesting to think about how to communicate it in a way that's meaningful and effective for folks. And in learning to communicate it, I've actually found myself having to really think carefully about what the heck is it really. I get a lot of pushback because these kids are often amazing at speaking their minds and using their voices. And so they regularly sort of challenge me to what the heck does that mean? And one of the things that I often get pressed on is assessment. Like, does that mean like you're measuring me? Like, am I being weighed and measured? Are you deciding if I'm valuable or not, or if I'm smart or not? Or like folks want to say, are you trying to put me in a box? Are you trying to label me? Are you trying to diagnose me? And so it's been a real journey for me to think about, well, what does it mean to talk about assessment differently, and maybe to talk about assessment in a way that doesn't feel quite so measurement oriented or comparative even, right? Like I'm not looking to weigh and measure you here. And one of the things that, I think some of the youth I work with have really influenced me in is thinking about it a little bit more in terms of goals, and that an assessment is a way of identifying what things are important to you, what matters to you, in order to think about how we can learn about that beautiful brain. I love that, Andrew, your beautiful brain. It's such a great way to say it. But how learning about your brain influences the way you go after those goals. And you might have goals, your teachers might have goals, your parents might have goals, other support workers in your life might have goals, and we'll think about them all. But it became interesting to start talking to folks about assessment more as about goal identification and finding pathways to those goals, because then it wasn't also exclusively about what do I have and what do I bring to the table, but rather the interaction between what I have and what everybody else brings to the table, and how that combination can actually generate something really meaningful and positive, right? Because nobody ever really operates in a vacuum. And sometimes that beautiful brain and my unique strengths and stuff are awesome. But if they're not fitting well in a context or an environment, then finding ways to use them can be difficult. And so reframing around, okay, well, what's the goal and how do we get there, creates a space where lots of folks can have voice and contribute. And then we start thinking about journeys and stories a little bit more than boxes and categories. And I think that's been helpful for me in terms of rethinking it and storying it. But I also feel that my own journey with assessment is still evolving, and as I think about it. So, yeah, that's kind of where I come from anyway.
Yeah, I can see how you focusing on goals will make it more meaningful for you and the clients, the people that you're, assessing, right? And so it is reflected in your book. So I'll plug the book. If any practitioners out there are kind of like, oh, what does this mean? And for the general public, like it is a bit confusing because you might go to see a psychologist and then you're like, well, why can't you just assess me, right? And typically, if we're a treating psychologist, we can do a general assessment, but we're not doing a formal assessment. And so differentiating between formal and general assessment, again, this is going to be very confusing to a lot of folks, but if a kid goes for a psychoeducational assessment, that'll be a formal assessment, right? And there'll be a formal report that's provided afterwards. And that report can then be taken to the school. If your child is going to a treating psychologist, they might be treating what they've been diagnosed or not diagnosed with from a formal assessment, but you won't get the same kind. You'll have to ask for a letter or maybe some support, but it's not going to be the same thing. So depending what you're looking for will depend what kind of supports you might get. So just going back to what you were saying about goals and what is the purpose, what do you want to learn from this, or what do you hope, where you want to go, and how might this assessment help you with that? I love that because, like your book explains, in the past, traditionally, it's been a referral question. So a psychologist will get a referral question. Does this child have ADHD? And then we're looking to rule out or rule in different diagnoses. And, just talking about goals changes the approach, changes the framework that we're going to apply when we're maybe using the exact same measures, right? The same instruments. So I'm going on a bit of a soapbox here, but I think you can jump in and fill in the gaps for the folks that are listening.
You really nailed it. And it's not about whether or not somebody has ADHD, and certainly we can all decide that. But it's interesting, I might have a family call and say, okay, I'm wondering if my child has ADHD. And I'll be like, awesome. Okay, what brings the question to mind? And they're like, well, they're all over the map and they're struggling to stay in class, and they're always distracted and they can't get through their coursework or any number of things. And I'll be like, oh, okay, so what do you want to see look different? Like, what would you actually want to see your child doing? So I understand what child's struggling to do. What do you wish they were doing more of? Well, finishing their work and staying in class and, these things. I'd be like, awesome. So we can do an assessment where we explore what it would mean for your child to, stay on task and stay in classroom and get through work. And that may mean that we talk about things like a diagnosis that could be appropriate and could inform some support. It may mean that we also talk about other strategies that could support their learning or other challenges that they might be experiencing that we're not even aware of right now. We might also be able to identify some real strengths and say, well, part of the reason this is going on is because they're really bright and they're kind of ahead of it, or because they're, wanting to tune in multiple things at the same time. And we can actually see that as a strength. That's not always a barrier. We might just need to create a learning environment that feeds those strengths as opposed to disadvantages them. So it changes the story so that we're suddenly talking about that beautiful brain in terms of how we can build strategies within the individual and sometimes look at how their own skills can grow and develop, but also how we can inform environments and others around that person so that they have the right information to provide support. And sometimes that, to me, is one of the biggest places is how we change environments and how we create well-suited spaces for all different kinds of beautiful brains. I'm going to keep saying that beautiful brains thing because if I keep repeating it, I won't forget it, and I really like it. So yeah, I can't help it. But I really love the idea of saying, how do we change environments? And simultaneously, how do we influence those in those environments to say, rather than saying a child who is disordered or a child with a difficulty or a child with a problem, how do we genuinely create stories around unique children that feature their difference, not as a deficit inherently? And it doesn't mean that there aren't areas of difficulty or challenge, but that we can recreate a story that identifies the opportunity that exists in that difference so that there's always a bit of a balance to the storyline as we support kids moving forward. And I think that changes the way we think about it. I think even educators, teachers, parents, it's like, oh wait, so there's two sides to this coin. Okay, cool. I can work with that and that matters. And then maybe even kids, when they get a little older, depending on what age they are, when they're in, they might go back and read that assessment. And instead of reading an assessment and saying, oh wow, look at all the things that were wrong with me, they can read an assessment that says, oh, cool, this is kind of me. And I'm a whole bunch of different things. And there's stuff I do really great and stuff I don't. But at the end of the day, these are things that help me work towards my goals. These are strategies and approaches and ways that help me inform my supports or work within environments to maximize everything that makes me me.
So a question about that, Jackie, as you were talking about, restoring those deficits or weaknesses or what we think of them as that into uniqueness and trying to explain how we can work with that to actually perhaps even become a strength of theirs. But then in the assessment, we will then put in a diagnosis, right? So there's this sort of like diagnosis, this quote unquote label that says this is what you have. It's a learning disability or ADHD. So while we're writing this beautiful report and really trying to focus on the strengths and the uniqueness of this individual, at some point we have to dump in there that diagnosis. Then how do you explain that to the person who's reading it or you're trying to explain to them after all this wonderful things that you've pointed out, you've got this learning disability.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that can sort of be this sort of drop off where it's like, oh, but you told me I had all these strengths and now I've got this diagnosis.
I love that question because I think, and I think actually sometimes we talk about assessment, we say, oh, we need to do more strength-based assessment. And I'm always kind of like, I don't really actually know what that means. And sometimes I feel like that actually gets kind of tokenistic. Oh, here's my strengths paragraph, or and I feel like it becomes this forced dialogue. And what I prefer is increasingly, and ask me again next week, and maybe it's changed, but increasingly is balanced conversation where we're talking about things I do well and things I don't do well with full ownership. And there are things I don't do well, and there are going to be things you don't do well. So your storyline and adopting a balanced storyline isn't about saying nothing can be wrong or nothing can be bad. It's about situating that information within the whole person and saying, this isn't who you are. this is an area of difference that's going to create some problems for you because it's really different. You have other strengths that are going to help counterbalance a bit, and we'll work with those. But we don't have to be ashamed of our difference or our difficulty. We don't have to say, oh, I don't want to say I have ADHD because it somehow makes me less, or I have a learning disability, therefore I'm less. It's like, no, I got a learning disability. That's awesome. I'm fine the way I am. In fact, it's kind of great I have a learning disability because it's given me a real different perspective on how to think about disability. And it's actually helped me hone some strategies and skills for working that augment this. I've got better at communicating with people and advocating for my own needs because of this learning disability, because I understand it and I've learned how to articulate it. So we can own all sides and angles of ourselves. And so I think it's not about saying, I'm going to tell a one-sided story. It's about, I'm actually going to tell a balanced story. And rather than some of those more historical versions of assessment where they've been a little bit more focused on, let me find the problem and define the problem. I think what we can do when we do goal-oriented assessment, when we're saying, where are you trying to go in life, is we start to create a balanced story, which is difficulties and strengths, because that's the human space we hold. And you can be proud of who you are for both of those. There's no shame in disability, not at all. It's just a distinctness and a difference. And that's okay. And increasingly, as we listen to the dialogue around neurodiversity and we start to own things, and folks with developmental disabilities are saying, yeah, I have autism and I'm great. My neurodiversity is actually part of who I am. And I wouldn't want that to change. I actually like who I am. And I love that. And I think that's great because these are things that are who I am. So a learning disability isn't who I am. It's how I learn. And so I learn differently. That's what a learning disability communicates. So people need to know that because we need to adapt learning contexts. So I am set up for success, but it's not inherently a limiting factor. It's just how I learn.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking like you are a disruptor. Like I want to keep contrasting what like traditional formal psychological assessment has been, and I know you cover this in the book of like the history of it, right? But even the way that I was taught, the way likely Andrew was taught. So again, for those that are getting an assessment right now, it might not be the way Jackie's talking about it, right? She's kind of on the cutting edge of like shifting this a bit, because I have had so many clients that have brought me their assessment report of themselves or their child and are devastated, right? They're just left with this piece of paper that was debriefed, but it was a half-hour debrief. They left that debrief thinking, I have this or my child has this, and it's going to be really bad for them, right? And so because the assessment was not balanced, because traditionally, right, depending on the referral question, we might just focus on deficits. And those deficits might lead, like Andrew was saying, to a diagnosis, which possibly could lead to supports and services that require that diagnosis, right? So it might be a way to get supports. But oh my gosh, the process of that for a lot of people has not been good.
And I think that's a big distinction diagnosis can be super important because it does connect to support. And so, I don't have a problem with diagnosis and identifying things. I really don't. I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's just a person thing. But how we contextualize that and how we sit that and what kind of prominence we give it, I think is where things start to matter. And I think, like in the book, we talk about assessment, both for intervention and motivation. And those are the two things that we really talk about. And the reason we talk about those, and I think this is where I always circle back to this goal thing that I get back to, is if I think about assessment inherently as an intervention, simply because even if it's not a structured formal intervention, I'm in a conversation with somebody, I'm a professional and I'm saying things about them, that's going to influence the way they think about themselves, their child, their context, their potential. That's influencing them. And anything that influences is an intervention in my mind, right? It's something that could stick. And it's not just the diagnosis I make or don't make and the recommendation for support that I make or don't make that constitutes a potential intervention. It's the entire collaborative or non-collaborative interaction with people, and the way in which it shapes the way they see themselves, each other, their family, and so it is an intervention. And more than that, it's an opportunity to engage somebody in moving towards desired directions in their life. So not only is it inherently going to be an intervention because I'm interacting with somebody and I'm going to have some kind of influence, but I can then think about, with that motivation side, how that intervention actually contributes to the ability of somebody to move themselves towards a given goal. And so it can be an intentional intervention that facilitates that movement, so that instead of showing up in your office, Dave, saying, "This is terrible, I feel awful, I'm devastated," that's going to be movement away from some things, or maybe movement towards despair, or movement towards avoidance, or lots of things, as opposed to things that can support a healthy identity and a sense of confidence and acceptance, moving away from shame and towards just sort of, this is who I am, and that's okay. And so I think we have a real responsibility to how we collect information, the open conversations we have with folks to understand, how do you feel about diagnosis? What does that look like for you? Why would you like it or not like it? Would this be a barrier to you achieving your goal, or could this be helpful? Because if it's going to be a barrier, how do we want to go down this road? We might want to rethink it. Those collaborative kind of conversations help us even think ahead, because we're constantly thinking about, how is what I'm saying to you intervening in your life right now? How much am I hearing your voice in terms of what your values are and what's important to you? And if this assessment's going to move you anywhere, I want to be really conscientious that I'm doing all I can in my power to align with sort of your value system, your philosophy, and help move these in a direction that's going to be promoting wellness for you, your family, your community.
I think to make any assessment useful, and these thoughts just came to mind as you were talking about that, Jackie. There has to be buy-in from the person who's coming in to do it. So what I mean by that is, going back to what I said earlier, like, we might have someone come in, a family come in because the principal said that their son or daughter needs an assessment, or the doctor said, oh, you need to go for an assessment, and so on. So they come in, and it can seem like a daunting process, right? And when we hear the word assessment, it's like, okay, what is this step-by-step process going to look like? So step 1, do this, step 2, so on to step 10. Okay, so here's the sort of approach that we're going to take, and it can be pretty regimented. But I think the utility of it has to come from a place of warmth and compassion. So when you were saying, Jackie, like, it has to be a collaborative process. We have to give a voice to the person who's walking through that door into this sort of grueling or daunting process, or what seems to be that. We have to disarm them, right? Otherwise, they just see this as just another thing that they have to put their child through, or they have to put themselves through. When we give them a voice and we show that warmth and compassion, and we ask them questions, and they can go on for a 10-minute talk about, all the things that are going right or not right, that's when it becomes a collaborative process. We change that narrative of this word assessment, which seems so formal. And it is sort of a little bit of a formal process, but we can make it a more inviting process, rather than one where it's like, you just come to the expert, quote unquote expert, you do this, you leave, and here's your result.
Yeah, I agree. And I think by making it more inviting and more collaborative and even collective as a process, we get rid of the hierarchy a little bit. I'm not here to be right and to tell you how to live your life, or to provide sort of this top-down thinking. I really think that assessment can be co-created. I think that it's an integration of expertise. And by that, I mean, sure, I have lots of knowledge about psychology and brains and testing and all these things, but you have expertise about yourself, your child, your family, your culture, your spirituality, your all of these other places, spaces, that is critical to thinking about, what would your pathway forward look like? What are your goals? How do you work towards those? So in the absence of that kind of information, we're really limited, I think, in our ability to provide some meaningful suggestions, recommendations, or even a meaningful storyline to a family and to a school community or any other community that requires it. So I really agree. I think we can be inviting, and I also think that we can shift the power a little bit and try to be a little bit more equitable in the distribution of power and say, your knowledge is as valuable as my knowledge. The assessment is
Mhm.
about taking our two sets of knowledge and putting them together in some meaningful ways, generating some solutions and opportunities and pathways. And I'll often refer to it when I talk to families or talk to individuals and talk to youth is this is your story. This is your story. And so we want to tell you the story in a way that's well-rounded and that identifies, some nice clear spaces that help you move forward. But it's got to still feel like your story. And that I think is empowering and I think it's more mobilizing than, come in, I'm going to ask a bunch of very structured questions and then I'm going to, do things in a very fixed way and draw some conclusions and tell you what your family or what you as an individual need to do. And here's my expertise. And certainly I will share my thoughts. You guys know me well enough. I'm not shy. I will offer what I'm thinking, but it's different to offer what I'm thinking in conversation, in collaborative spaces and equitable spaces where I say, okay, I'm kind of thinking this. I'm kind of wondering this. What do you think? And people say, well, I think that's the worst idea ever. And I'll be like, all right, well, tell me why and tell me what would be an alternative. And let's work it through here to create a process. So I'm not shy on having an opinion. And I'm certainly not reticent about saying, we have some research, there's some evidence, there's information that can help us here. That's
Mhm.
my job is to bring that to the table. It's just that research evidence and all of that data doesn't necessarily mean more than you, the individual, your family, and your social context experience and knowledge, right? That also matters. Research is aggregate data. I'm dealing with an individual. And so, how to contextualize and work with that in meaningful ways, I can't say that my information is more valuable than your information. And so, I think that's part of that giving voice. And I think that's part of that inviting space that we create. And I think it's also adds sort of a real authenticity to it and sometimes a bit of vulnerability.
Mm.
Because sometimes I have to go, oh, you're throwing out everything I have to say. All right, then, going head to head with you and disagreeing is certainly not going to produce anything that's going to be conducive to intervention and motivation. You're just going to put it in the garbage, and all that writing I poured into it is kind of lost. So, how to work those things through sometimes really takes a bit of humility too, and to
Mm.
say, wait a minute, how do we get this to a place where I still feel it's evidence informed? I still feel like this is ethical and appropriate, but also responsive. That's a process.
I'm having flashbacks to doing my master's practicum at a school board and even the first time debriefing an assessment with parents. And I was so scared that I was going to be presenting information that they did not agree with or that they did not like or that. And what I found when an assessment was done well was that it was almost like affirming. It was like, hey, you just met my kiddo and you really get them. Like you have figured out a lot of the things and maybe even have some words to explain why we've been struggling in these ways or why things are easy in this way. So
I love
again,
that.
yeah, it's just like really neat to actually see that. And of course, there are times where parents are getting information that's hard to take in or is surprising, but you could build that into the debrief and say, like, is any of this surprising? What is the most surprising part of these results or these kind of, yeah, results? Because a lot of times it is like testing or even of the report. Is there any of this, like even the wording of it that doesn't fit for you, that doesn't describe your child? So I don't
Yeah.
do a ton of assessments right now, but so that's why I'm drawing back to back in the day.
But I think I think that's just it. Is there something surprising? And I even have leaned away from sort of I always do sort of a follow up, like a meeting where we put it all together and we make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of how do we go forward. But rarely is it the first time that I've introduced the ways I'm thinking, right? And often It'll be like, even as I'm interacting with the child and I'm wondering, I wonder, I'm thinking, exploring different ideas that help us understand the unique kind of constellation of strengths and difficulties that your child has, and trying to think about that understanding. And I'll bounce it off the individual, the family. I'll say, these are things that are coming to mind, or these are things I'm noticing. Have you noticed these things? How have you thought about these things? Have you ever heard about these things? If I have like different diagnoses, I really like to avoid surprises, and I like to avoid a big reveal, and I like, maybe maybe that's me, but I like to just sort of have a process. So by the time we're there, I'm able to kind of draw on conversations, and I know you guys kind of wondered this as well, and that this is not something you thought of before, but I think it really does fit. And this is why. And remember when we talked about this, and remember when, and to integrate it into more of a process and less of a top-down kind of decision making. And then I agree, like it's really wonderful, because I think I find a lot of families and individuals, especially when I work with older youth, will say, finally somebody saw me. And didn't just see me to pat me on the head and tell me I was great, or to tell me I was totally broken and a real, this, that, or the other thing, but somebody who genuinely sees me for this part and that part. And families who say, oh, so you mean we're not screwing up? And I'm like, of course not. You're doing a great job, but you have a unique child. And so unique children call for unique approaches. And I agree. I think it can be normalizing. I think it can be really validating. People can be seen and heard, and also still feel that their entire child is seen, and that they don't feel like they're the failures or their child's a failure. Like, it's just
Yeah.
stripping out that language, right? And reframing it a bit.
What comes to mind right now, Jackie, as you were talking about like different ways to present the information for any early career psychologist or anyone who's going into this field, I think it's so important to find a really good supervisor who can model that warmth and empathy, even doing an assessment. I think what I sometimes hear amongst colleagues and just, the general psychology community is that, well, you're either an assessor or you're a therapist, right? But I really truly believe that if you are a good therapist, you can also be a very good clinician, because the way you communicate with the family, with your client, that's half the battle, right? You have to gain their trust. You have to connect with them so that when you are presenting the information, you're not doing it in a robotic manner. You're not just saying, these are the scores, here's the next score, and here's the next score. But it's compiling the information so it's digestible, it makes sense. And well, to your point, it's collaborative. You can call an audible if you need to and say, hey, as you're assessing the situation, maybe they're taking the news harder than you thought they might. And so it's like, okay, I need to change things up for a moment here. Let's slow down a little bit. Let's take a break if we need to. Do you have any questions? Or is there anything that surprises you? So it's like seeing that modeled is such a good way of learning. So whether, when you were my supervisor, Jackie, or when I was here in Ontario and we had to do a full year of supervised practice, I had some amazing supervisors out here as well. Just seeing how that's done, it's not a robotic process, or it doesn't have to be.
That's a really great point. And I think, supervisors are so influential, of course, and so too are, your peers and the peer relationships that you build, throughout your career to influence us. And I think being exposed to that, and being able to have really good, honest conversations with supervisors. And I often encourage students to talk about, borrowing from things like, counseling spaces, to say, ask your supervisor, what's their philosophy of assessment? And people are like, I'm sorry, you're what? But what is your philosophy? What approaches do you employ? What are the values that you hold highest? What's your positionality? Who are you, and what space do you bring to this? Are really great conversations to have, to start opening the door to what kind of decisions do you make in terms of level of warmth, or ways in which you frame or even organize your assessment. How often do you talk to people, and even how do you structure your process? How many days do you see somebody over? Do you focus a lot on the ideas of working alliance or therapeutic alliance, these really counseling terms, but do they not have applicability with an assessment, depending on how you organize or see yourself as situated in the assessment practice you provide to say, no, I actually think having shared goals and respect and mutual positive regard and all of these things are as important for an assessment as they are for any other clinical practice. So these things are important. And I think that when you're in a supervisory kind of context, asking those questions, respectfully, but asking those questions is really great. And it's not only great for the learner, but as somebody who's done supervision, I have learned so much from some of the really hard questions that folks like you guys have asked me when they say, well, Jackie, why do you do it that way? And I go, because somebody taught me to do it this way. Wait a minute. Which sends me to a space where I have to really reflect and say, well, who said it has to be done this way? Where's the evidence that says this has to happen before this, that says I have to structure it in this way? The evidence around assessment practice is really, really limited. I mean, we have stuff that talks a little bit about test validity and reliability, lots of stuff around our tests, our tools, but there's not so much about the entire full process or the outcomes of an assessment or the impacts. We have lots of work out there about our reports, and a lot of it's not so hot, telling us that our reports are too full of jargon and lingo and nobody really understands them, and I don't know what to do with 14 pages of recommendations, or I mean, there's lots of tension in the field in terms of the limited research, and then I look at the counseling field. And it's like there are thousands and thousands and thousands of articles on best practices and different modalities and models and approaches and philosophies and how they inform different approaches to counseling and might be a different fit for different clients in a different context. Awesome. An assessment, we say, well, there's formal assessment. We maybe say psychoeducational, as you guys have sort of identified, but there's lots more assessment. We don't necessarily identify it similarly. We don't really understand strong differences between models of assessment. What's the difference between, a collaborative assessment, a strength-based assessment, a therapeutic assessment? We can go on, and there isn't a lot of research. So it makes it tricky. And so I really think there's some value in borrowing from all of these other psychological professions and spaces to say, how does this influence the way we do work, particularly around our goals? And I think being asked by supervisees has forced me to do that, because I keep getting asked these questions and I'm like, oh, there's no answer in the research. I don't have a good answer. I've got to dip into whatever research is available to help me rethink, why do I do things the way I do?
Sounds like a new research program for you, Jackie.
Yeah, it's been something. We've been spending some time on some of it for sure, Andrew. You know me, I am always going in a few different directions and saying, how do we do this? And I'm particularly interested in not just how we think about our process and be collaborative, but how we do a better job of communicating and what we choose to communicate, what information even goes in reports, how we protect privacy while also communicating sufficiently to support intervention and motivation, all of those kind of questions. So those are things that we're all rolling around over here. So I think there's going to be some evolution, and I think there is starting to be some evolution in our field as we're turning our eyes towards assessment to say, how do we ensure that these partnerships with families and individuals are actually generating improved outcomes for the individuals who are engaging in assessment? How can we be confident in that? I think we're getting better at thinking about that. I think we're getting better at monitoring outcomes. I do a lot more follow-up in my practice. I do a lot of continuing consultation post-assessment, because I think it's important to know what's working, what's not working, what can we modify. So I think our field is evolving. I think we're doing great work. We're having great conversations. Lots of people are asking me really, really hard questions like you guys.
Yeah, and I think there's a long ways to go. And then even Jackie, since the last time, like when I was doing so even from my master's to my PhD, this assessment for diagnosis or looking for diagnosis, right, was a focus of the instruments that were being used, the assessment process, making sure we were non-biased, right? And not kind of spending too much time getting to know the client. It was, you have to stay unbiased. And then meeting you and working with you a bit in this like assessment for intervention. And how can this assessment process, these results, actually feed into and support interventions that are going to help this child, right? And then since we last spoke, now you've already added more. You're putting in motivation, right? And so it is an evolving process. And one of the great things about you is that you are, you're opinionated and you know things and you're open to new ideas, right? And so this is where, probably maybe my biggest beef with assessment has been is that it's been quite closed off, or it's been quite traditional. And so a lot of unless this has changed, this is just my perspective. And, if you do a formal assessment, you can't do treatment, or very rarely, because the assumption is that you're going to be like feeding yourself, so that like you're going to diagnose people and then be treating them, and you're creating your own business and you'll be biased in your diagnosis. Again, when you go to a GP, they might diagnose you and treat you, and we don't think that they're going to be just diagnosing you with something so that you come back to them. But that has been kind of this traditional, and the reverse. If you are treating someone with counseling, you can't then do a formal assessment because you will be biased in your assessment process, right? So there's been clear distinctions of separating formal assessment from treatment, going both ways. And my hope is that there's a bit of softening in that. And I have seen that, there's actually some validity to someone knowing someone really well to be able to answer some
Oh,
of these assessment
absolutely.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, there are good ethical principles we need to be considering, and we need to be thinking about how we're really clear and how we're offering best service. And sometimes you're right. That means, or not that sometimes the rules are right, I suppose, if I want to call them that, that there needs to be a clear delineation in roles. But I think like anything, it's context dependent. And I think we have to ask. And I think just enacting a rule because it's a rule, I think there's an ethical space that we can explore. When is this better? This individual's been through tremendous amounts of trauma,
Yep.
difficulty forming a new relationship or setting this up. This actually could be more traumatizing than working within this safe relationship. So let's think this through and reconsider. And I think I've already, sort of alluded to this, but this idea of bias and that when we don't build a relationship or when we don't engage, that's somehow less biased. I'm like, no, we're just as biased. Bias actually lives in our assumptions, our perceptions. If I engage with less warmth, I'm going to generate a difference in the type of relationship I form with the client, which is going to change the information they share with me. It's going to change and influence how they work on these tests. So whether I'm aloof and removed or warm and responsive is going to actually influence what happens in that process. And in all cases, whether I think I'm removed or not, I operate with certain bias. I always do. We all do. We can't even ask a question, even how we say things. There's always bias, right? We come with positionality. We come with perspective. And bias doesn't make us bad. Bias makes us human. We're products of our own lives, our own experiences, our training. And just as when we talk about assessment not being about good and bad per se, it's about balance. I think we look in the mirror and we say bias is not about good or bad. It's about balance. It's about reflection. It's about awareness. It's about consulting with your colleagues to say, is it appropriate that I do this way? Does this sound reasonable? Is this relationship still healthy? Am I thinking about the best interest of my client? We need to work together and collectively to be accountable. But I agree, rule for rule's sake isn't always, to me, clear, and I think at times can be really disadvantageous to our families and kiddos and youth and folks that we get to work with.
Yeah. And that's why even for myself, I don't follow those rules per se. We think about it. But let's say like you've created such a positive rapport with the family. And let's say I diagnose someone with autism spectrum disorder, right? Like that's not a light diagnosis. Not that there is a light diagnosis, but like a lot of families take that with a heavy heart. But you've provided them with, this beautiful conceptualization of why you've come to this conclusion and what this could mean, what are the positives, what's still going really well. And so there builds this foundation of trust. Right. And so let's say a family comes back and says, hey, you know what, we had such a positive experience. Can we keep working with you? Like, you already know us. You already know what my child is like. You know what the family dynamics are. And they're asking, can we continue working with you? Barring extenuating circumstances, the question is like, why not? Right? If I already know this child's case and I can provide additional support and assistance to the family and the schools and everybody in that village that's supporting this child, why would I say no?
I think it's an important question. And we fall into things. And maybe it's like you guys were saying, sometimes with our training or just experiences, we get used to a certain standard or way of doing things, and we're trained in a certain way. And I think we're also really conscientious about being ethical and operating, systematically and doing, air quotes here, the right thing. And I sometimes think that, makes us almost more protectionistic of ourselves than actually deeply reflective in terms of what it means to do the best for the folks we work with. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of consultation. I don't like to work in isolation. In our practice, we will often consult and sometimes we'll have folks who will continue to come back and work with somebody else in the practice and work with how that works. And, it might be the same for you guys as well in terms of how we create these collective spaces so that we can make these decisions in responsible ways. But it, I think, reflects a higher level of intentionality when we can ask ourselves why and have really clear defensible reasons that apply to that specific context, as opposed to these generalized rules that are just the rule.
Well, I was just going to bring it back to the listeners. And I think, you're probably listening to Jackie and going like, yes, yes, yes. At least that's what my head's doing. But, knowing out there in the wild west of psychology, that is not always the case, right? So I want you to hold this as like the gold standard and something to look for if you're looking for an assessment for your child or for yourself, right? Maybe asking the assessor, what is your philosophy? What is the process like, right? So the same thing like what Jackie was saying about supervisors, do the same thing. Look for this because, I know that this does not always happen. And so some of the work that I do, I'm actually coaching clients to prepare themselves for a very difficult assessment. So let's say I'm working with someone and I know an insurance company is involved, and the insurance company at some point is going to send them for an IME, an independent medical evaluation, and it's generally done with a psychiatrist, someone they have no familiarity with. They're going to meet one time. It's going to be a 90-minute interview, and there's going to be a report written, and that is going to stay on their medical file, and that is going to affect their insurance claim, right? So this person, like Jackie was saying about being kind of cold and aloof, that is a real possibility, especially if I don't know the person, right? They might show up for this clinical interview, and it is very clinical. It is very cold. It is very factual. And you're going to be asked things about your trauma, about these things that are very difficult to talk about. So best case scenario, I'm able to kind of prepare them for it. They go through it and they say, I never want to do that again, but I got it done. And I'm like, great, because otherwise your benefits don't continue if you don't participate in these kinds of things. So sometimes people are forced into assessments that they have not asked for, don't want, but other, when we're working with insurance companies or other third-party providers, this is a real possibility. So just kind of, expanding this. And if people do have bad experiences with assessments, yes, the assessment could have been done ethically, properly in a lot of ways, right? Within the systems that are working or in place right now, right? So I'm sure this could generate a lot of conversation about how assessments are done, how assessment results or outcomes are used in, different ways.
I love that it would generate conversation. And I do appreciate your saying this is not about good clinician, bad clinician. And there are more than one ways. There'll be a lot of folks that will say, I don't want to work with that Jackie. She's way too, this, that, or the other thing. One size does not fit all. And we do need to be diverse and varied in our approaches. I don't think it's about everybody doing the same thing. Some people are going to be like, I don't want her to sit here and ask what I think. I just want this diagnosis. Like, this is what I'm in for. This is what I want. Can we just be quick and cut to the chase? And if, like, we need to have enough flexibility and diversity in our field that we can be responsive and meet folks where they're at. So I think that's really important. I don't think this is about broad strokes, professionals who are good or bad. I think really it's about having conversations, asking questions, and as professionals, for us to really reflect on the level of intention and saying, yeah, I do it this way, and that's okay, and this is why I do it that way. Totally fine. It's not one size fits all, but it does mean really being intentional and saying, I know exactly why I do it this way, and I can actually unpack these. And I know the other day I was sitting in class, in an assessment class, as a matter of fact, and folks were talking about, oh, it's important we do this for transparency. And I said, what does transparency actually mean? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I mean, like, because you can see through things. So what are you seeing through? And I said, transparency for whom, by who, according to who? So, is this so people see what I'm thinking, or is it so that we see what they said, or is it like, what is the purpose of that? And can you unpack that for me a little bit more? And it really created a big conversation around how much information is included in the report, how much of the client's really personal, private details do we include, how much is necessary. Can I hear lots of stuff and not put it in a report to protect their privacy because I don't think it's necessary? And is that not transparent? Well, no, it doesn't have to be in there. My report isn't proof of principle here. And so what does that look like? And so really working through some of those thoughtful conversations about some of even the language we use sometimes to say, well, I do this for this reason. I'm like, okay, can you unpack that even a little bit further for me? Because I'm not sure if showing my work, if it exposes a client to an extent that they feel really just uncomfortable, is that fair?
Yeah, no, when I supervise clinicians, I think one of the comments I probably use the most is like, what do you mean by this? Like, I'll
Yeah.
put on the margins a comment like, what do you mean by this?
Mhm.
Right. And to unpack that, it's like, okay, let's think about it from the client perspective. If they read that, what will they think? Right. So for example, like on the BAST, right? There's the atypicality scale.
Yeah.
And it's like sometimes I'll have people who put in like they've scored that this range for the atypicality scale. It's like, okay, if someone asks you what that scale is about, how will you explain atypical?
Mhm.
Right. So think about how we report some of these things because the reader can have a very different interpretation from what you mean. Like you don't have any malicious intent in writing this, but someone may interpret that very differently.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so much in our words and our language. And I always think it's really interesting to ask ourselves about how we report, how much we report, how much detail we need to have in there in order to communicate the core messages. And when
Yeah.
the detail is actually makes it harder to get to the core message. And sometimes I feel like we say, oh, this scale said this. And so that, we list all of these scales and we report what was normal or not normal and whatever. And then maybe we have one sentence that says, so this means this. And I'm like, wow, we dedicated 2 paragraphs to what was average or not, and then have sort of a one big concluding sentence. And I'm like, are we asking others to interpret our data or are we going to do it? And as opposed to sentences that don't talk about scales per se or talk about them in a more narrated fashion that says, yeah, this person describes, that there are times that they feel particularly sad and depressed more than others, and they might be really worried a lot, and that might keep them up a lot at night. And that really fits with some of the things that we talked about in our interview. And they also describe some behaviors that might be considered by some to be a little bit unusual and even uncommon for their age, but also like we can create narratives around these scales that can be accessible to readers, can still align with our information, but are actually about communicating, not just reporting. Like we're not just reporting data, we're communicating. We have a message that is important for somebody to pick up. So how well are we actually communicating that core message as opposed to just reporting facts?
And we're interpreting. right? We're not just like, here are the scores. It's like, what does this mean? And so that sometimes I think can get lost. And at least my experience with like psychoed assessments is oftentimes it could be written for other professionals, right? To show that we did, we administered the right measures in the right way, and that like here are all the scores. And oh man, like most of the clients don't care. They flip to the summary and recommendations section, like, what does this actually mean? And half the time people are walking away going like, I still don't really know what this means. So, I don't know if I could book another appointment to find out more. So hopefully if you are sitting there with an assessment report for your child or for yourself, like really ask questions and get some clarity around it, because yeah, a lot of these measures have a lot of jargon in them and they're not straightforward. And the scores are different for different measures. And sometimes people will have like the actual scores of the assessment included in the report, right? And it's like, then they're Googling this stuff to look up what does this mean? And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not the way assessments should be done, right? And yes, it does cover the minimum requirements of doing an assessment, but so many times people have a lot of questions. So, yeah.
And I think, I'll add to that too, that I really like what you said. If you're out there listening and you're thinking, oh, I've had this happen and I didn't understand, I think it's fair to say, and speaking on behalf of all of our colleagues, that it is always okay to reach out and say, I need another explanation, and this isn't making sense to me, and you need to unpack it more. And I think sometimes folks are either overwhelmed or uncertain or even feeling like, oh wow, what's wrong with me that I don't understand this?
Mhm.
No, I've had reports that I've received from colleagues where I've had to pick up the phone and talk to the colleague and say, yeah, I don't actually understand what you're saying here. And so,
You're brave.
well, I don't know. Andrew, I just sometimes have to do it. And I mean, even colleagues like I respect, and you know what? People can call me too because I can say all this stuff, but you know what? I don't always get it right. And every now and then I have clients that come back and they'll like, what the heck did you mean when you said this? And I'll read it and I'll go, huh, yeah, I don't actually know. It might have made sense in the moment, but that was not well done. And I'm constantly learning, and frankly, I think I'm still far from the mark. I don't think I've figured out what it means to write the best kind of report I can write that effectively communicates. So I am not suggesting that I'm there, and I am really thinking that if all of us think about it as a bit of a journey, we keep working on it, and then invite folks to continue to reach out to us and say, this isn't making sense. It's on us. It's our job to make it make sense. It is not the job of the public, of families, of what kids, of educators to try to discern what we meant or what the implications are. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. So if we haven't done it in a way that's working, ask. We're okay with that, I think.
I think, Jackie, like what you said there, it really shows your humility. And I think to be a really good assessor, there has to be a sense of humility. I think sometimes in our profession, we think, oh, we've been to school for so many years and, we've done our dissertation and so on and so forth. And we got the titles that we're all of a sudden the experts. But I think we need that sense of humility to continue to be curious, to continue to question what we do and why we do it. And when there's a better way of doing something, we consider it, right? And I think all of the like the really, really good or even best clinicians that I've come across, whether you're a therapist or an assessor, there's always the trait or characteristic of being humble and not thinking or even present in a way that you think you know everything.
Yeah. Because, well, we don't.
There you go.
Shh, don't tell everyone.
Oh, my bad. Did I just let the cat out of the bag?
Oh, geez. I think, yeah, okay. Usually at the end of these talks, we do a bit of a takeaway. What are we going to walk away from or take with us as we're carrying on in our own journeys? So I'm going to give you guys a chance to do that first while I gather my thoughts.
Well, I think for me, just reconnecting with Jackie, like this was so much fun, and it reminds me of, when I was out in Edmonton, and but if anything, I think just the constant reminder, Jackie, even through our conversation today, the importance of how we use these assessments. It's not just scores and qualitative descriptors of what these scores mean. It's how do we make it useful for those who need it most? And coming from the perspective of compassion and empathy, I've always found that if we can come from that angle, that perspective, people will follow through on our recommendations 10 times fold than if we were to just present scores, right? I've come across, I think, to your example, Jackie, I've come across people who have come back to me and they show me an assessment and I go, was this ever explained to you? And from their perspective, it was like, no, it was never explained to me. Maybe it was at one point explained, but at some point in the process, maybe they were just, whether they were shocked or surprised, like they just started to tune out to the assessor sharing this information. And I think that's where that human connection is so important, right? You have to be aware of who's in front of you and whether or not they are receiving the message.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, it's basic communication. It's everything we do is what's the point
Yeah.
if it's not actually helping us make progress towards whatever those goals are? What's the point? And I think, I think that's the take home. And I think that idea of usefulness really matters. I love working with youth and families and I really love working with teens. I don't know what that is, but I really do. I do. I think it's great because they really speak their minds. And I think that's been a big training ground for me. So I really think that assessment can be a really exciting shared process where, reflecting on and identifying goals and then creating a pathway towards those goals. I mean, how exciting that can be. And instead of an onerous or a difficult process, it can be kind of fun and kind of exciting and learn a bit about yourself and maybe figure out what that looks like and how you can get where you want to go. And I'm excited by the opportunity to embrace it in that way. And even when you're worried for or concerned about what somebody might be dealing with, if it's something that's a really significant developmental disability, there's still space to say, okay, well then how do we go forward with this? And how do we go forward with this in ways that are meaningful and track a pathway that is going to feel exciting to you and positive. And it doesn't mean that there isn't times of grief or worry or all of these other human emotions. Those are great and normal. And those are things you feel when you love somebody. How great is that? But still, there's a journey and there's a path. And so I think assessment is just this really wonderful opportunity to walk alongside somebody and say, let's capture your story and let's see if we can't help pave your road forward a little bit. I mean, what greater gift do we get than the invitation to kind of walk with somebody in their life for something like that? Like fantastic. I love it.
All right, Dave, you got to follow up to that.
Yeah. Oh, I can. You know what? I love it too. I think this has reinvigorated my interest in doing assessments. I've moved away from it quite a bit, but two things that really stand out for me is the goals, like kind of saying, what do you hope for? Right. And I ask that to my counseling clients all the time. Like, what are you hoping to get out of this? And I didn't really do that with assessments all that much. Right. So I think if I continue with any assessments, that'll be part of that initial process. And then secondly, the collaborative process. I often felt like I was gathering all this information and then I was summarizing it and making interpretations, but it wasn't like what you were talking about, Jackie, this kind of a process where you were gathering some information, then you were asking different questions, then you're gathering more information. And I like that. I like that it can be more of a collaborative process rather than me coming in, doing a bunch of assessment instruments, and then summarizing it and providing that information. That did not feel right. And now I know why. So thank you so much.
Jackie, thank you so much for being with us today. It was such a fun conversation. I think we've all had assessment experiences and we could all speak to it and learn so much from you still. So if you're interested in Dr. Jackie Pei's work, her book is Aim High: Growing the Motivational Potential of Youth Psychological Assessment. And like I said before, her website is down in the description below if you're interested in the research program and the research that she's doing at the University of Alberta. And also her practice clinic website is www.empowergrowth.ca. So thank you so much, Jackie. It was a lot of fun. And if you enjoyed this podcast today, subscribe, like it, follow, leave us comments, questions. We love them and we love responding to them as well. And until next time, take good care.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Take care.